Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us, from today. A very warm welcome. My name is Miguel Morales. I'm the commercial lead for the Americas at Cumulocity, and I am your moderator for today's session. We're excited to have you here as we explore how AI is fundamentally reshaping the security landscape for connected equipment. I am very happy to introduce today's experts on the call. So we've got Nico Neuberg, Director of Product Management at Cumulocity, and James Penny, the Chief Technology Officer of Device Authority. Guys, welcome to the call. Please take a moment to introduce yourselves and say a sentence or two about your company and what they do.
Let me start. Nicolas Neuerburg is my name. Like Miguel, I am working for Cumulocity. I'm leading the product management team at Cumulocity. And at Cumulocity, what we basically do is we help equipment manufacturers, so company who produce equipment and sell it to their customers, to make this equipment smart and basically connect this equipment to their back office processes to be able to remotely manage the equipment, get access to the data, and use that data actually to drive business outcomes. And then handing over to you, James.
Thank you, Nico. Yes, lovely to meet everybody. Yes, I'm James Penny. I'm from a company called Device Authority, and we have a platform called Keyscaler, which works as sort of our IoT IAM. So our specialty is in onboarding devices, establishing a root of trust with devices, and then effectively giving them everything they need to do their job, from identities to updates and sort of continuous authorization in between.
Awesome. Thank you for introducing yourselves. We're going to move on to the agenda. I've had the pleasure of working with these guys for a couple of years now, and I'm very excited for this conversation. I really like the security topic. I think there's this romantic tension between good and evil, right? And when I was looking for analogies to host the webinar, I live in Texas, so I thought of an old Western movie. And so you'll see that the agenda, like any good Western movie, has a core conflict, right? We're going to have a setting for the battle. We're going to pick our setting. We've got sheriffs, we've got showdowns. There's a saloon at the end of the party, so it should be a lot of fun. And we'll start with the core conflict that I think AI presents in security. So we'll start with a paradox that I'll pose. The smarter the devices get, the more vulnerable they become. In other words, even though AI is helping us differentiate our products, it's also creating problems. I'm curious, when I say something like that, James and Nico, how do you see this paradox being true?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in reality, the more access or the more capabilities you give to anything, the increase for risk and danger, humans included, to be fair. Some people can't be trusted with some things. And in order to grant them those access and those capabilities, you have things like access to data. You need to communicate with others, and you start to introduce this level of complexity that, unless you sort of secure by design, as the saying goes, you'll end up trying to reverse engineer security into all of these complexities once you get to the end of that sort of development road. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a case of the more access to data, to things, to capabilities that you give something, the higher the risk for anything going wrong, really. And the security is always this battle between the bad guys and the good guys. and which one's which probably depends on which side you're on. But the people who are defending themselves, the defense team, have to get it right like 100% of the time, right? That's the expectation. They have to get it right 100% of the time. And the bad guys who are trying to attack these devices or just get into your network or do anything else, they really only have to get it right once. Now, the benefit that the defense teams had before is that it was, you'd have one person or you'd have a team of people maybe trying to attack certain devices or certain parts of your network, and it would be limited by the number of hours in the day and maybe how much caffeine they could take in. But the problem now is AI gives you such quick access to information, and you have these sort of nefarious GPTs, if you like. I won't name them for the sake of not weaponizing anyone who might be listening, but who can quickly write these the POCs and concept code for any attack that you really want as quickly as possible, with probably minimal changes needed to actually use them in the real world. So, I think it's this. You have these more inherently risky devices and things connected, and you also have now these sort of entry-level people who could probably pull off some fairly advanced attacks with AI, or with the help of AI, I should say. I don't know if that makes sense. Nico probably has more thoughts.
Maybe I think what AI also gives you, it is a great ability to scale. So if you're a security expert, if you're an expert at hacking things, you can also scale your expertise much easier, because with this AI, it's basically a superpower for automation. So before AI, you had to write your automation logic by yourself. Now you have this little large language model as a brain in an agent, which can act pretty much autonomously. And this, I think, the real danger is not that the beginner level hackers will get more dangerous, but the expert level hackers will get much more dangerous, because suddenly they cannot attack only one company, but they can attack a lot of companies simultaneously. And I like what you're saying about this complexity always gets bigger. I mean, that is the bad thing, and that you only need one successful attacker to defend to breach a system. And that I like this chain analogy. So you have this this chain with a lot of links, and if you make a system more complex, what you're doing is you add new links to it, and basically the attacker only needs to attack one of the links to get into the system. So the more complex the system, the more potential entry points you have, and of course that also edge computing paradox, where you have a lot of very powerful things you can do. You can locally host AI models, but then again, an AI model is something so complex from a logic perspective that you don't even know what happens in this large language model brain. What if some base model has some attack vector integrated in it? So there's a lot of things which are getting very, very complex, which also become potential entry points for somebody who wants to get into a system.
That's awesome. So I'm hearing we've got, in order to be more intelligent, access to more types of data. Maybe some of that data is sensitive, maybe some of that data is proprietary, in order to enable intelligence. So there's that risk. The devices are more connected because a lot of the inferencing is still happening in the cloud, some of it's happening in the edge, but mostly still happening in the cloud. So they're more available to be targeted at scale. And the complexity sort of makes it more difficult to even understand what's going on in the device, to profile these devices or decide what's normal. And so the attackers, if you will, have a lot more surface area to play with, and they can scale way faster leveraging these AI tools, right? So the responsibility for security increases across the board when we introduce more intelligence. And I think it was interesting, James, when you mentioned that you end up reverse engineering if you don't plan for it up front. I see this a lot of times where security, it ends up being like the last box that gets checked before like the production schedule, which is coming 4 to 6 weeks away. It's like, oh well, now we're going to really like turn on the security that we intend to use. You end up in these like tricky situations of, did we validate this complex process? If you get it wrong, you have to go all the way back to manufacturing. So it's super important, to design for it up front in a program to reduce the overall risk to the program, while of course reducing the risk to the attacks themselves. So let's pick a setting for our battle. There's a famous quote from Jim Barksdale. He's a former CEO of AT&T Wireless. He was quoted as saying, "In the battle between a bear and an alligator, it is the terrain that determines the winner," which is kind of a silly way to say you got to pick your battles in security, or at least we have to define the scope we're discussing, because it's so broad. Like enterprise security is such a big topic. And so if we're going to define our terrain for this scope of security, we're talking about smart equipment manufacturers protecting distributed fleets of connected products and that they manage. And we want to protect them from the most common attacks. So we're going to try to use the NIST cybersecurity framework, which I love as a way of thinking about security as risk mitigation. But in that context, James, help us understand, like, how does connected IoT device security contrast to overall enterprise security, or how does it complement it? What makes it unique? What makes IoT device security unique in this territory we've picked?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of similar foundational elements, I think, between enterprise or sort of corporate security policies and IoT. And as I say this, IT guys will be saying, please don't put IoT security on me. But so anyone who's sort of worked on policies for I don't know, ISO 27001 or SOC 2 or whatever it might be, you have these foundational elements of who's using what. You have an asset registry. You know what laptops people are using. You know what desktops they're using. You'll probably prescribe certain bits of software either to enforce or manage things like disk encryption, antivirus, stuff like that. There's similarities between that and IoT security in terms of knowing still what's running on your networks, what's running within your connected environments, what sort of state they're actually running in. And I'll come back to that bit, but and sort of the software that they're running, and is that software trusted? Is it put on by you? Is it put on by someone else? Where it might have come from. So there's a number of questions I think that still get asked and need to be answered in both scenarios. There's a couple of things that sort of makes connected device security a bit unique in that it, in my experience at least, it doesn't seem to have any kind of bias towards company size. So scalability is a true problem that you can face with your 30 people or 30,000 people. And one of the reasons for that I've at least seen is you don't have enough people to necessarily manage them. And you might have a 30, 40, 50, whatever, a company with hundreds of employees or a company with tens of thousands of employees, and they might both be deploying 10,000 smart devices. And in the IT world, at least for the majority of it, you have humans attached to those devices. You have a person on the laptop, you have a person on the desktop, you have this sort of human factor. And you don't necessarily have that in these connected devices. So a lot of them will be headless devices. You might have a human adjacent, maybe if it's a piece of manufacturing equipment or a hospital or something like that. You might have a human adjacent interaction, but won't necessarily be on the device and using the device. The other to to that end is also the physical security aspect, because there's no human, there's no one really watching it. Like, I know where my laptop is at all times. It's either, you know, it's on my desk, or it's in my rucksack, or I don't really let it out of my sight. And the same can't really be said for those connected devices. So you have this almost like physical, like, if you're in retail, for example, they might be on the shop floor. You've got customers walking by it every single day. I'll just pop one off and walk home with it and see what I can do with it. So I think there's maybe two areas there where it vastly differs. I think the scalability one is the one that I think people struggle with the hardest, where you have this sheer volume of devices and not enough people to manage them, which I guess is where AI can help augment that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think I can manage 1,000 of any like thing. I have to keep track of 1,000 things, you know, even on a spreadsheet. Like, as humans with eyes and brains, like it's extremely challenging to be as disciplined. And the consequences of when the consequences are so severe, you know, automation also it almost becomes necessary. And yet I'm amazed how many companies don't automate, and it's still like someone's job, you know, to track the certificates for 10,000 devices in the field. But I think for these reasons, like you said, you know, these are oftentimes not associated to a person that has to log in and therefore gain access to the data. These devices have to manipulate this data and gain access to systems independent of a human, like being authorized or authenticated to log in. What I love about the NIST framework, and the reason I put it at the heart of this, is it assumes failure, right? I mean, to your point that like the bad guys only have to win once, it's true, but if you plan to lose a battle, you can still win the war, I guess, would be the analogy in the Western, because you can, it's only the first two parts that are, you know, have to do with protection, or the provisioning of the protection. Everything else about that NIST framework is what happens when somebody got in, and how do you still maintain appropriate governance for devices that have been assumed to be compromised. And I wanted to ask Nico this question, you know, around keeping security updated. Like, how do customers, if I have 10 different device types and versions of the hardware and versions of firmware, like how do what's a good example of customers keeping their security posture updated and upgraded in the field?
That's an interesting question. Actually, when James spoke about the differences between IoT security and enterprise security, I agree it's a lot the same. I think one big difference is that every company has an IT security team and several years of experience and knows this is a problem. We have all these employees, they have all these enterprise applications, and a lot of companies have much fewer years of experience with IoT devices. So I think this realization, I need a similar practice to manage the security of my IoT device as I need to manage the security of my enterprise IT systems. That is really important, because for enterprise IT systems, you do actually use a framework like the NIST security framework to actually also proactively plan what actually does happen when there is a cyber security incident. How do we actually respond? And I think for IoT, the same maturity curve also applies. We also see that with the times, like from the first pilot towards getting more stable with the rollout. Our customers realize they need this security monitoring as well. They often extend the scope of the IT security team to also look after the connected devices and make sure they are up to date. And then I think this software update, of course, as you mentioned, Miguel, is of course important, that you keep your software on the latest stage. What is as important as well is like you said, to prepare for the worst case. So luckily, we haven't yet seen a real incident where hackers successfully could breach an IoT device. However, what we did see is quite a few successful dry ones in terms of penetration tests. And they're often very good wake-up calls. So when basically a specialized security company twice to reach a device. And one example we had is that the security company took a different device, used the credentials was able to retrieve the credentials from that device and then get access to data from other devices. And I think that is a very good example. If you do these penetration tests, there's this in security terms, you say the principle of least privilege, that you need to make sure that the device can only access or do the stuff it really needs to be doing. So it should never be able to access data from any other device. Because imagine that you're selling equipment to different customers and suddenly one customer has a security breach and that leads to data from another customers being uncovered. That is something you definitely do not want to do. And I think this is really where this NIST framework is great, that it's not just about assuming the worst case, it's also preparing for the worst case, like simulating what happens if I'm breached. You do not want, after the security incident, to think about what should I communicate to my customers. Ideally, you have all this communication pre-approved from your CEO and can just act on an agreed upon plan, and then also make the impact of the incident much less severe. And a lot of those big impact of that is also the loss of trust from your customers. Imagine that you as an equipment manufacturer, somebody gets foiled on, hey, you had a security incident. What are other customers thinking about you? Probably they don't trust you with your data. And that is something you do not want, because then you cannot do any effective service of the equipment, etc., if you don't get access to their data.
Yeah, I have a 4-month-old baby. And I think to this day, like, baby tech is affected by that hack where people were able to like remotely get into the video camera. Like, nobody wants their cameras on to be remotely accessible. Or rather, there's a whole line of products that differentiate on the fact that they're not online and therefore and
that makes me crazy, Miguel, because 90% of the incidents you have out there are because you have unsecure passwords and because devices are reachable by the outside. You should never have an IoT device which can be reached from the outside. So
you're kicking off the next slide, Nico. I think that's a great point. Talk to me about authentication. We set up the terrain, we're posted up, and the bad guys are coming. They have a couple of favorite attacks that they like to use. Explain authentication for me, and what the heck is an X509 certificate, and why is it better than a password? Because it does seem like that is the most common way that people get into devices.
Yeah, so authentication is simply the fact of proving who I am. So I authenticate, I prove that I'm Nikolaus Neuerburg is my way of authenticating myself. I can do a video authentication, so you see me, you know me. So maybe that's the way of establishing trust between the two of us. But that does not work that well if you want to get access to an IT system that doesn't know your face and your habits. So what you usually do is you use something like a password that you pre-agree upon and say, hey, I have this password, you have this password. When you speak to me, I prove you that I know the password and you trust that's me. And that's the same for IoT devices as for usual people. If you look into what happens with authentication for your IT services, you see that there were a lot of attacks where you stole the password and then an attacker basically could authenticate as yourself. So you introduce things like two-factor authentication. So I also need to prove that I have my mobile phone and can click on OK. That does not work for an IoT device. An IoT device doesn't normally not have a mobile phone,
thumbs,
so
right?
Thumb is missing. So what do you do with an IoT device? And there X509 is a great answer. So what an X509 certificate basically is, it's a way for the device. It has a secret, so that's different from password. You have always this asymmetric encryption, so you have a private and a public key. And you actually never send the server or certificate authority or whoever you talk with your private key. So you keep that for yourself. You never share that. That's different from password. Passwords you always have to share so that the other party can see, yeah, he really has this password. For certificate, use these fancy asymmetric security algorithms to never share your secret, your password, and still can say, hey, that's me. And then, especially for the IoT world, there are also things which are called hardware secure modules, which allow to put the password or the secret in a very secure hardware chip that can never be read out, that destroys itself before it can be read out, so that you have this secret which can never leave the device. And this way, you can get a password to negotiate a certificate with a trusted, you call that certificate authority. And the certificate authority once has to see the device and prove, hey, that's really you. And you get a certificate on the device, which cannot be manipulated. So the device really has this ID card, and nobody else but the device can prove that this is my ID card. And this is exactly what happens with this X509 certificate. You get this ID card to the device, and the device is the only one who can prove that this is actually my ID card and not yours. And that's a great way. It's much secure than passwords because they cannot be stolen if you have a hardware secure module. So if you have hardware security on the device, you never transmit it through a line. And most important, you cannot set a static or default password. I mean, a lot of these attacks are because vendors use always the same password or they use an insecure password, and that cannot happen with certificates.
Nice.
If I may, also, that's one thing that Nico just touched on is actually really important in terms of secure by design as well. So for the hardware security module, trusted execution environment, whatever you end up, TPM, whatever it might be, that's an example of something you don't want to wait until the last step, because you'll have to respin the whole board potentially to get that hardware capability on that particular device. So that's a really good example of something that should be thought about from the beginning, to make sure you're not spending a whole bunch of money having to go back and redesign your board.
And that
I have seen that.
That's the TPM, including TPM silicon or module inside your embedded system in order to securely store those keys that are provisioned in manufacturing, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be very upsetting late in the program. And is it only for devices, or are these certificates used elsewhere in the enterprise?
You can, in theory, use them everywhere. So X509 certificates are also used to authenticate services. If you are developing software and use Git, you most likely use X509 certificates also for basically authenticating your computer. So you have a certificate so that your personal computer can authenticate against the versioning system for Git software-based development. That's very common. So it can be used everywhere, I would say, for IoT devices. The only difference is, I mean, there are other standards also, like passkey for human-based authentication. I think for IoT devices, there's not really any alternative to using X509 certificates. That's the only very advanced security concept that allows for secure authentication of an IoT device.
Nice. So yeah, I think of authentication. I realize I probably shouldn't show my driver's license up close, but I think it's something of like, I say, hey, I'm Miguel, and somebody says, I don't believe you. I give them my driver's license. And if they still don't believe me, if they think I'm, younger than 21 in the United States, they go into the back and they scan this little encrypted code. And I think, I'm pretty sure that this is like assigned by the certificate authority of the state of Texas and encrypted to authenticate me as who I am on this picture. Miguel. And that takes care of device spoofing, because if you know all of the concept of device spoofing would be, I can create a new device that has an identity that you accept, which if it's a password, all I have to do is tell you the password and boom, I have access. That's what happened in the Mirai bot attack. It took down the East Coast. I don't know how many years ago now. Everybody used to talk about it, but it took down the internet on the East Coast for a couple of days or something. It was a pretty significant attack. So that's authorization. Some of these other attacks, like unauthorized access, or you exploit these passwords and you gain access to other systems that you had discussed, have to deal with authorization. So James, the question for you, can you explain the difference between authentication and authorization And then, where is AI in the mix? You use the term continuous authorization. Help educate us a little bit about those differences and the benefits of using them together.
Sure. Well, it's sort of one comes before the other. So authentication and the identity is the foundation, really, of that sort of relationship that you're establishing between a device, a person, whatever it might be. And that is, as Nico was saying, that is who you are. That is I am James, or I'm Nico, I'm Miguel, and you're proving that fact. And now so once you've established who you're talking to, you then need to establish what they're really allowed to do or allowed to have access to, and that's really the authorization process that follows on from that authentication process. I like to think of it like someone going to a bar, in that you show your ID, and Miguel, you thankfully set that one up nicely. You show your ID to get into a bar, and that proves that you are who you say you are, and that you're the right age and whatever, and you get in. But every time you order a drink, what's really happening is, just because you got into the bar doesn't mean you're necessarily always authorized to get a drink. The later in the evening it gets, the earlier in the morning it gets, depending on how late you stay out. There is an authorization process, effectively, that's taking place in the bartender. And the person, you get to a certain point, you're no longer authorized to get a drink. You're authenticated. I know you are who you say you are, but you're no longer allowed, you're authorized to get access to that particular thing. So that is really the difference. And that's also sort of a metaphor for continuous authorization too. So it's not just because you managed to prove who you are once and we established what you had access to once. Authorization is a little bit more sort of contextual, I feel, especially in IoT. You could, as a simplified case, I could be accessing data all day long between working hours, 9 to 5, whatever. Let's say the office closes down. Should that device still have access to everything if it's doing it at 2 o'clock in the morning? Does it really have a reason to? Should it be still authorized at that point? Sometimes headless devices do operate 24/7, but it's not always the case. And in that regard, also the state of trust is important for devices too. So again, we talked about some of the attacks, and rightfully saying, if you are attacked and what happens when we get attacked, and there is something on that device, a continuous authorization process will make sure it's still in a known good state, potentially, before you give it access to something, data or process or otherwise. So it's really a great, it's a more complex question, I feel, than just the authentication process, because it does need to take in so many other factors, especially when you are considering things like the software that is running, the time of the day the device is running, does it always run at that time? And that's where really AI can help augment or extend the people assigned to kind of look after these devices from a security perspective. We actually participated, some members of Device Authority participated in a study, I think it was with the Turing Institute, about what level of autonomy and sort of cyber defense we would be comfortable giving to AI or machine learning processes. And the outcome of that really was to still sort of have a human in the loop in various stages of that. But AI can certainly help get you wider visibility of the things that are going on, spot the things that are abnormal, anomalous within your environments, and help at least, raise the warning flag on what might be happening, so that you can have a human say yes or no. Because a lot of times,
that's interesting though. You're talking about continuous authorization. I mean, that sort of implies you need intelligence running sort of full time, because you're not going to have any human continuously looking at a device profile. And like, what does a device profile mean anyway? So you're saying there's context of device behavior, and almost like some kind of ML model for how the device behaves. Do you like sort of model the behavior of the device, and then if it acts funny, it's kind of like the bartender saying like, you're acting very different than when you showed up. Like,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's it. So you certainly can. you can do it both on the device and in server-side processes too. Because if you're present and you're looking at the events or whatever might be happening in where the devices are connecting, again, what time of the day did they normally do it 3 times a day, and now all of a sudden they're doing it 200 times a day, things like that. There are these sort of indicators of compromise, they call it, where you don't necessarily know what the vulnerability was or how someone got in or what software might be causing that. But you can see that it's doing something that it shouldn't be doing, and that is an indicator of compromise. And you can then sort of take your remediation action to shut it down, quarantine it, take it offline, whatever it might be.
Nice. Now, the third one, I think, is the third attack. So that's unauthorized access. If you have continuous authorization, you're constantly monitoring the state of the device, or I would assume it's some polling frequency or whatever method you choose. It's a question of both authorizing the device to communicate with its resources, but people also authorizing the device, right? Or users of the system authorizing the device. So I think there's both angles in there. The unpatched software and firmware. I feel like this is a really big deal now with the Cybersecurity Resilience Act, right? Saying that you have to identify, if you're an operator in the EU by 2027, you have to identify any vulnerabilities on the devices you operate, not the ones you manufacture, but if you buy and operate in the device, and you have to at least be aware of a vulnerability that exists on the device and offer a solution to have it patched as the vendor. If you're selling the connected device to that operator, you know, identify the vulnerability, offer up a patch to that vulnerability. And this is a difficult problem because, as we said earlier, like, intelligent devices are starting to aggregate all these different libraries, SDKs, versions of software, and access to GitHub. One of the areas that I know Device Authority works on, and we collaborate with you guys, is around using SBOMs. Can you explain what an SBOM is? Can you explain how it's being used to help simplify the management of which vulnerabilities exist on which devices? And maybe give us a taste of what industries are adopting SBOMs faster than others.
Sure. So SBOM stands for Software Bill of Materials, and really what it's saying is this is a list of every software library or otherwise provided by the vendor that's running on that device, the software itself, the name, and the version. Hopefully, the version of that particular bit of software that's on there. And what you can do is then you can utilize that software bill of materials actually within the authorization process. It's one of the sort of parameters within the given context of the authorization process that I was talking about. So there's a couple of different things that you may want to check. One of them being, are there any new vulnerabilities today? You know, since I woke up, has anything catastrophic happened overnight? And is there anything that I should be aware of based on the inventory of software that I know that's running on that particular device? Is there anything that would change my sort of trust perception or my risk score within that particular device that I should be aware of? The other one is also one thing that we've also focused on at Device Authority is ensuring that the same software is still running. So if you think about for example, someone getting onto a device and downgrading the version of OpenSSL to a particularly vulnerable version that has a tendency to leak various bits and pieces and secrets, then that would also change my position and my view of what I think that device should have access to, or, you know, should it be quarantined? Do I continue to trust it? So is the software that's supposed to be running on it got any vulnerabilities in it that we need to know about? Because that is an ongoing battle. I mean, there's 20,000-30,000 new vulnerabilities a year that is having that is a increases your chances significantly of finding whether your device has vulnerabilities, and making sure that the device still is running that same software that you expect it to be, and it hasn't been downgraded, changed, modified, whatever, to a version that might, leak anything it shouldn't. In terms of industries that I've seen adopted them, it feels like low hanging fruit and it's easy to pick on them, but healthcare. Healthcare has a lot of regulatory pieces that also sort of govern the way it works. There's some various FDA controls for different bits of software and things like that, and you get things certified. You can upgrade certain bits for security. You can't do other bits without requiring recertification. So healthcare is one I've seen that's put a lot of work into it, as well as automotive, actually. Automotive and healthcare, two that I've seen really adopting it.
Nice. And so when we look at the defenses for these attacks, right, we talk about the secure identity validation, which we covered, the real-time threat detection. Are there any other ways, Nico, from like a IoT platform standpoint, that people using an IoT platform can identify anomalous behavior?
Yeah, sure. I think James already covered a few things, like, for example, downgrading a software version. I think that was a great example. Like, that should normally not happen. So if that happens, that is a definite indicator. So I think what's important is you need to start with a secure foundation. So I think the two things you should make sure from the beginning is your device is not reachable from the outside. So this limits attacks from people within the company networks on site, which is already much better because it greatly limits the potential of attackers who can actually gain access to your system as they need insider knowledge. And then, of course, there are a lot of indicators which a device sends that can give you insights about something weird is going on. So, for example, the IP address a device uses. If this IP address changes and somehow my device, which is supposed to be in Texas at Miguel's home, is moving to Germany, that is something anomalous. But just the number of paid authorization requests. So I have a valid authentication, so I'm the device, but I want access to a resource I do not have access to. It's another indicator of there's something strange going on. But it can also be more subtle. So it can also be, maybe you already breached the system and now you change the way you want to operate the system. Maybe you want to steer parameters in a way that you're not supposed to it, especially in critical infrastructure where you might want to mess up the operation of a power plant, for example. These are very specialized attackers who know what they are doing and who also know to camouflage their steps, where it gets much more subtle to detect anomalous behavior. And their AI can be of great help because you can basically collect all the data coming from the device and see, is there something going on which doesn't happen on any other device? And this can be because of a security incident. It can also be because of maybe the power plant component is getting towards the end of life. So when we speak about predictive maintenance, what you do is actually exactly the same. You spot anomalous behavior, so something not going right, and then the root cause. Normally, people are actually looking for, hey, this component is actually screwing up. It's getting broken. But another root cause for it actually could also be a bad actor actually trying to sabotage stuff.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I'm gonna peel us off of this slide, and we'll have to come back to the SIEM tool integration another time, because I do think there's an interesting element around automating the response with a SIEM tool. But I want to get into the sheriff. So let's imagine that we won the battle, we protected ourselves, we did security by design. At the end of the day, the sheriff in the Western town is responsible for maintaining security throughout the life of the town. And that means provisioning new people, let's say, that show up into the town, as well as, the monitoring and I think we get to really apply the NIST governance model here. So let's keep going with some of the security nomenclature I hear all the time, and I think is not always clear. How do you establish, like, what is a chain of trust? How do you establish it, from the factory to the field? And without naming names, do you have any examples where people really mess this up? Nico.
So in a chain of trust, when you in the certificate world, what you normally refer to is a certificate is signed by someone, which is called the certificate authority. And if you have here, for example, a factory, you might actually have 10 factories who all provision certificates to devices. So you can decide whether you want the same certificate authority with the same also private key being able to sign a new device and giving it the ID card at each of the factory, or you want to establish a so-called chain of trust. This means actually that you have one certificate authority that signs other certificate authorities, so that the factory actually is a sub-certificate from your root certificate authority. So your company gets one certificate authority, which is maybe trusted by another common one like GoDaddy, because every browser knows them and automatically accepts them. So you might want to start with a very common certificate authority, get your one certificate authority, and then have a separate one for each factory. So if one factory get compromised, it's only located to this factory, this compromise. And then the factories, when they go to the devices, they can sign the ID cards of the devices, so the certificates of the devices with the factory CA. And you are asking what often goes wrong. So we have seen customers who actually put the certificates on devices, which is great, but they use so-called self-signed certificates. So basically, they just create their own certificate authority and sign it, and then send the device in the field. Which is okay, you can do that, but you do not have a chain of trust. You do not have this, hey, this person or this factory really signs the certificate for this device. And then you kind of fall back to the security of a password plus approach. Other thing we see is that we also see customers who are signing these certificates in the factory, but they have not really thought about how do I renew the certificate, or maybe they thought about it but say, hey, it's so complex, we figured that out next year. It's also a very bad practice, because once you have the certificate on the device, also the cryptographic algorithms, they evolve. And maybe a cryptographic algorithm which is secure today won't be in two years. So normally what you do is actually, each certificate has an expiry date when it needs to be replaced with or renewed with a new certificate. And there's a good reason to doing that, because think about quantum computing. It's pretty probable that progresses in quantum computing someday will make existing ciphers unsecure. So you want actually to keep renewing your certificates with all the technologies periods, so that you stay secure. So these are two patterns we see, that you do not actually prepare for the renewal of certificates, or you use self-signed certificates, which is both something which from a security perspective is problematic, because you don't have this ID card which was signed by somebody, or you do not have a way to update your certificate once the cipher you're using, for example, becomes unsecure. James, maybe you have some other examples. Also, one great innovation from device authority is actually the dynamic key generation, which is also on this slide. I think that's also worth explaining how that works to establish this initial chain of trust.
That's a seamless segue. Thank you, Nico. Yeah, no, I agree, but I agree with what you say. It's largely about crypto agility, right? So it's as the algorithms become older, you want to change your certificate authority for whatever reason, you want to add more certificates, you need control of what's on those devices, what's being provisioned and what's being renewed on those devices, so you can have better control of its identity and make sure that you can move with the times. Security has a history of things falling out of being secure. That's just the nature of the way it is. And having that crypto agility allows you to move with those times, as Nico was saying. Yes, so we do have a technology called dynamic device key generation, and by no means is it to compete against things like HSMs or TPMs. Really, it's augmented by them, and X509 and birth certificates and everything like that. And really what it does, it's a challenge and response mechanism that allows you to sort of put the same software builds on all of your devices. So if you think about security as like the scalability issue, you could put the same software build on all of your devices. If you have the means to put in birth certificates in manufacturing, by all means do so, and any other things that might be able to augment that process. But what it does is it basically uses the device's sort of inherent unique attributes to kind of identify itself, and then you basically create all your registration records in the back end, and it allows you to do it from a centralized perspective rather than being forced to touch every single device to put something in there. But it certainly by all means can use any certificate, password, things like that. One-time password we've seen people use as well to connect to the platform. Once we've established that trust, so we use that technology to establish that trust, we can then say, okay, you need an X509 certificate to talk to, the Cumulocity platform. There's some updates here too. You should, figure that out. Do we need to sign those updates? Do you want to give it encryption keys for the data that it's either storing or sending? That's really what it is. So it's a way, it's a software only solution that really allows you to onboard these devices and equip them with the kind of credentials and the security things that it needs, including crypto agility, to do its job effectively for the lifetime of that device.
Awesome. So you use the device's inherent attributes to establish the initial root of trust consistently across varied hardware architectures. That's an interesting approach. And so the device makes it out of the factory, you provision into the real world, and it's time to, like, I just bought some Sonos speakers. The very first thing that we do is you get on the app and boom, you hit a firmware update, right? In that firmware update, what's the difference between the birth certificate and an operational certificate? And what is software attestation? Why does it matter? Why is it a best practice?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for the first bit, I mean, the birth certificate really is, that it helps establish that initial root of trust. So it means that I know that this is, as in Nico's example, is a very good example. It came from that factory. It's signed by that CA. We all trust the root CA, and that allows me to know that that particular device is at least manufactured at that plant. The difference between that and an operational certificate, as Nico was saying, is it's really good practice to sort of maybe use that birth certificate just for the first operations and then rotate it out for something more operational. At least if you do that, you can catch like midnight manufacturing, for example, knockoffs, things like that may be being created, spoofed, and trying to be sold on some, some sort of dark web process, I guess, for people to try and use, and they think it's genuine. Maybe they don't. I don't know. But it helps effectively keep the credentials moving so that it's not a static target that people are really going after. And from a software attestation perspective, really, it's back to that. It helps with that authorization picture. So, it's the software that you're running, and as far as I can tell, the device that it's running on, can I attest to its sort of provenance and where it came from, and the overall trust sort of risk score or trust relationship that I'm establishing with this device is sort of predicated on, like I was saying earlier, a lot of these sort of contextual pieces. One of those being, the software that's running, the hardware that it's running on, did it already register and burn its birth certificate, for example, things like that, all make up the sort of overall picture of, okay, I'll let you into my services or access my data or do whatever it is you need to do.
Nice. I think of attestation of software almost like a notary. Like if I have to log an update to a trust, I am forced to go to a notary and show them my document,
Mm.
and I sign it, and then they say, yeah, I saw you sign this version of this document that you're now sending, right? That software attestation is like continuously notarizing the software updates that you send out. So I'm born, I get a birth certificate. I don't take my birth certificate to the bar. I receive an operational certificate that's been signed by the state of Texas. That is my ID. The bartender's authorizing me to access the resources I want. And if I want to update a legal document with the county, the notary is going to attest that it was me with that version of the document. And these are all powerful concepts that I think you guys have done a really awesome job describing. Thank you. We're reaching the end of the cycle, or of the time. And I guess I'm going to leave it with one question, right? Like, what happens to IoT devices when they die? Has anybody ever seen one? I've never seen a dead IoT device. Like, where do they go? Is it still a problem? Like, do you have to care at that point?
I think I've got a few in my drawer if you want to see one.
Fair enough. But
I mean, it is a good question, though. I mean, I've seen with higher value, lower volume devices like big medical equipment, they don't necessarily die. They get sold on. So decommissioning and recommissioning is a big part of your processes that need to be considered. They get sold on, but they still have data and identities on them.
Coming back to the traditional IT, I think it's something very similar towards having an employee laptop who gets decommissioned. You need to make sure you wipe things. You do not need sensitive data if you set it on, for example. You need to make sure that you remove the access so that the authentication is not valid anymore, that you remove the ID from your systems. And then it can go on, it can have a second life, it can go to the trash bin, it can hopefully get recycled, and these else can be reused for next gen IoT devices with HSM and increased security.
Awesome. Well, that's a hopeful future for those IoT devices. We appreciate, I sincerely appreciate you guys joining us for the fantastic insights. The key takeaway here, smart equipment security has to evolve at least as fast as the intelligence that we add to it. So AI is both the challenge and the solution. Please download the resources. We have resources for you linked in the chat. Do not hesitate to reach out if you'd like to learn more about us as individuals or about Cumulocity or Device Authority. Where do people get a hold of you guys if they want to chat with you?
Just drop a chat on LinkedIn.
That QR code goes to LinkedIn. So reach out to us. We'd love to learn more about the problems you're solving. Hopefully you learned something today. I know I always do from these two. Thanks again to everybody, and have a happy Thursday.